Chapter 14, Achieving Sustainable Development by Pamela S. Chasik. Development strategies in the early part of the 21st century have been shaped by the increasing tensions between economic health and ecological health. Capitalism, the predominant economic system, depends on repetitive expansion. This process of expansion needs and supports industrial processes with insatiable appetites for resources such as oil, coal, wood, and water, and it depends on increasing use of land, sea, and atmosphere as sinks for the deposits of waste. Clearly, there is a conflict between the economic system's relentless demand and the world's limited and shrinking supplies. Although there is concern that the ravenous economy will gobble up the natural environment, some scholars and policy makers suggest that the catastrophe can be avoided. With sustainable development, we can have economic growth while protecting the environment. Sustainable development involves many global actions, from the development of concepts to the negotiation, monitoring, and financing of action plans. For over 3 decades, the United Nations and its member states have tried to implement a global program on sustainable development with limited success. However, in 2015, the international community began to take the concept of sustainable development to a new level in the UN's New Development Agenda and the adoption of a set of new global sustainable development goals. This chapter examines the evolution and the concept of sustainable development and the contribution of the United Nations to understanding and implementing development that is economically, socially, and environmentally sound. What is sustainable development? Concepts of sustainability and sustainable development appeal to many people because they hold out the promise of reconciling these divergent views about the relationship between economic development and environmental health. Yet, while one can argue that reconciling the tension between ecology and economy is the central goal of sustainable development, there is little agreement on what sustainable development actually means. As a result, sustainable development has a multiplicity of definitions. Generally, it implies that it is possible to achieve environmental planning without sacrificing economic and social improvement. Some definitions emphasize sustainability and therefore the focus of the protection and conservation of living and non-living resources. Other definitions focus on development, targeting changes in technology as a way to enhance growth and development. Still others insist that sustainable development is a contradiction in terms, since development, as it is now practiced, is essentially unsustainable. The Brundtland Commission underlined concern for future generations by asserting that sustainable development is development that, quote, meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, unquote. The Commission, formerly known as the World Commission on the Environment and Development, but commonly known by the name of its chair, Norway's Gro Harlem Brundtland, was convened in the 1980s by the United Nations to formulate a long-term agenda for action on the environment and development. Definitions of sustainable development tend to focus on the well-being of humans, with little explicit attention to the well-being of nature. However, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the United Nations Environment Program, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature have proposed a definition that includes nature and highlights the constraints of the biosphere. Sustainable development is, quote, improving the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of supporting ecosystems. This definition observes the traditional hierarchy that places human beings above the natural world. It does emphasize our dependence on the biospheric envelope in which we live. Over time, the concept of sustainable development has evolved. It has been recognized that efforts to build a truly sustainable way of life require the integration of action in three key areas: economic growth, conservation of natural resources and the environment, and social development. Essentially, according to Peter Rogers, Kazi Jalal, and John Boyd, economic criteria cannot be maximized without satisfying environmental and social constraints. Environmental benefits cannot necessarily be maximized without satisfying economic and social constraints. And social benefits cannot be maximized without satisfying economic and environmental constraints. All definitions of sustainable development require that we see the world as a system that connects space and a system that connects time. When we think of the world as a system over a space, we begin to understand that air pollution from North America affects air quality in Asia, and the pesticides sprayed in Argentina could harm fish stocks off the coast of Australia. And when we think of the world as a system over time, we realize that the definition or the decisions of our grandparents made about how to farm the land continue to affect agricultural practices today, and that the economic policies we endorse today will have an impact on the urban poverty when our children are adults. We also must understand that quality of life is also part of a system. While it is good to be physically healthy, what if you are poor and don't have access to education? You may have a secure income, but what if the air in your part of the world is polluted? And it is good to have freedoms of religious expression, but what if you are not able to feed your family? All of our activities are a small part of a larger system, the planet we live on. Viewing our human systems as operating within the larger ecosystem is crucial for achieving a sustainable relationship with the environment and ensuring our own species' continued survival on the planet. Thus, if development is to be genuinely sustainable, policymakers need to make substantial modifications to their strategies and their assumptions. However, the difficulties of actually delivering on the hopes that many people around the world have attached to the idea of sustainable development have become increasingly evident. In part, these difficulties reflect political problems, grounded in questions of financial resources, equity, justice or fairness, and the competition of other issues, such as terrorism and war, for the attention of decision makers. In part, they reflect differing views about what should be developed, what should be sustained, and over what period. The evolution of sustainable development. Supportive ecosystems are the sole sources of the necessities of life, including air, fresh water, food, and the materials necessary for clothing, housing, cooking, and heating. In addition, and equally important, it is only within ecosystems that vital life-supporting processes can take place. These include the regeneration of soil, pollination of plants, and global circulation of carbon, oxygen, and other elements necessary for life. The vast majority of the world's peoples depend upon ecosystems that are often far from where they live. Trade and technology today bring produce of land and sea to shops from all over the world. For example, cotton grown in Egyptian soil with water from the Nile River ends up as undergarments in shops in the United States and Europe. Thus, in a sense, the Egyptian ecosystem supports U.S. consumers. Phenomena that disrupt ecological processes have similar extended effects. Climate change affect everyone, regardless of where they live on the planet, whether or not their emissions of chlorofluorocarbons, sulfur, or carbon dioxide have contributed to the problem. Yet at the same time, the evolution of the concept of sustainable development is subject to the divergent views of the industrialized world and the developing world. Developing countries continue to insist that the industrialized countries, because of their historical dominance in the combustion of fossil fuels and production of toxic chemicals and hazardous wastes, are responsible for environmental problems and should bear the responsibility for any solution. More generally, they identify the high levels of consumption in industrial countries as a key cause of global environmental degradation. For example, according to United Nations Development Program, today there are more than 900 cars per 1,000 people of driving age in the United States and more than 600 in Western Europe, but fewer than 10 in India. U.S. households average more than 2 televisions. In Liberia and Uganda, less than 1,000 in 10 has a television. Domestic per capita water consumption in the richest countries averages 425 liters a day, more than 6 times the 67 liters per day average in the poorest countries. The average person in an industrialized country like the United States accounts for nearly 4 times the carbon dioxide emissions of someone in China or India, and nearly 30 change in 2 months as a person in a least developed country generates in a year. Therefore, many developing countries argue that industrialized countries in the North must adopt more sustainable consumption and production patterns and significantly reduce the use of natural resources and fossil fuels before the South follows suit. As the international community became more concerned about the state of the environment and its relationship with economic development, this sense of crisis came to be reflected in a series of United Nations conferences held in 1972, 1992, 2002, and 2012. The 1972 Stockholm Conference. The Stockholm Conference, formerly known as the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, held in 1972, was the first large-scale environmental conference to look beyond scientific issues to broader political, social, and economic issues. It put the environment squarely on the international agenda. The Stockholm Conference took place at a time when issues of global equity were becoming more prominent in international forums. Developed countries clashed with developing countries over global economic relations and environmental politics. Before the conference, developed countries had identified a particular set of issues to be addressed, such as pollution, population explosion, conservation of resources, and limits to growth. But the developing countries wanted to enlarge the agenda to include issues such as shelter, food, and water. They were able to use their voting power in the UN General Assembly to press developed countries to adopt a more inclusive agenda. The most significant international outcome of the Stockholm Conference was the creation of the United Nations Environment Program. In the decades since the conference, UNEP has played a significant role in shaping the environmental policy agenda and in coordinating environmental policy within the United Nations system. The conference output also included the Declaration on the Human Environment, together with a declaration of principles and recommendations for action. The Stockholm Conference put the environment firmly on the political agenda and thereby paved the way for intensified multilateral environmental cooperation and treaty making. By stressing that environmental issues inherently are political and need to be subject to political negotiations and decision making, the Stockholm Conference rejected the earlier notion that environmental issues were primarily relevant only to scientists and other experts. The conference also identified a theme that has been at the center of international environment discourse ever since: the possibility of simultaneously achieving economic development and environmental management. The Brundtland Commission. While the Stockholm Conference successfully brought international attention to environmental issues, it did not resolve any of the inherent tensions in linking environmental protection with social and economic development. To bring back the focus on the broader issues of environment and development that had been discussed at the Stockholm Conference, in 1983, the UN General Assembly established an independent commission to formulate a long-term agenda for action. Over the next 3 years, newly established Brundtland Commission held public hearings and studied the problem. Its 1987 report, Our Common Future, stressed the need for development strategies in all countries that recognize the limits of their ecosystem's ability to regenerate itself and absorb waste products. Recognizing, quote, an accelerating ecological interdependence among nations, unquote, the Commission emphasized the link between economic development and environmental issues, and identified poverty eradication as a necessary and fundamental requirement for environmentally sustainable development. In addition, the Brundtland Commission popularized the term sustainable development, describing it as, quote, a process of change in which the exploitation of resources, the direction of investments, the orientation of technological development, and institutional change are all in harmony and enhance both current and future potential to meet human needs and aspiration, unquote. The 1992 Earth Summit. On the 20th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference, governments gathered again, this time in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to move the Sustainable Development Agenda forward. The Earth Summit, as it was popularly known, formerly designated Nations Conference on the Environment and Development, attracted greater official and unofficial interest than had the Stockholm Conference. More than 170 nations sent delegates, and 108 of these nations were represented by their heads of state or government. Thousands of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, sent representatives, and nearly 10,000 members of the media attended. The summit and the preparatory work that preceded it showed that there were still significant differences between the developed and the developing world. Consequently, each group provided different inputs to the agenda-setting process. Developed countries wanted to focus on ozone depletion, global warming, acid rain, and deforestation, while developing countries wanted to explore the relationship between their sluggish economic growth and the economic policies of the developed world. The concern was an, quote, environmentally healthy planet was impossible in a world that contained significant inequities, unquote. The major output of the Earth Summit was a non-binding agreement called Agenda 21, referring to the 21st century, which set out a global plan of action for sustainable development. In 294 pages, comprising 40 chapters covering 115 separate topics, Agenda 21 demonstrated the emergence of a clear international consensus on the issues affecting the long-term sustainability of human society, including domestic, social, and international economic relations, and cooperation on issues concerning the global commons. See Figure 14.1. The summit also produced two non-binding sets of principles: the Rio Declaration of Environment and Development and the Statement of Forest Principles that helped create norms and expectations, two legally binding treaties, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity, which were negotiated independently of the UNCED process on parallel tracks, were open for signature at the Earth Summit and are often referred to as the Rio Conventions, along with the 1994 United Nations Convention to combat desertification. The Earth Summit also marked a watershed in advancing the concept of sustainable development. As Tommy Koh, diplomat of Singapore who chaired the UNCED Preparatory Committee, stated, "It used to be fashionable to argue in developing countries that their priority should be economic development and that, if necessary, the environment should be sacrificed in order to achieve high economic growth. The sentiment was to get rich first and to clean up the environment later. Today, developing countries understand the need to integrate environment into their development policies. At the same time, developed countries have become increasingly aware of the need to cut down on their wasteful consumption patterns. The new wisdom is that we want economic progress, but we also want to live in harmony with nature." Millennium Development Goals. Concerns over globalization, the rapid growth and integration of markets, institutions, and cultures, and other emerging issues such as the HIV/AIDS pandemic, adding a new dimension to the sustainable development debate as the millennium approached. There was a growing recognition that the world was failing to achieve most of the goals for a more sustainable society set out in Agenda 21 and elsewhere. Between 1992 and 2000, official development assistance from industrialized countries plunged, while HIV/AIDS rolled back life expectations in some countries to pre-1980 levels, as the number of people living with the disease approached the 30 million mark. The world's population climbed above 6.1 billion in 2000, up from 5.5 billion in 1992, a significant increase in just 8 years. The total number of people living in poverty dropped slightly from 1.3 billion to 1.2 billion, but most of the gains were in Southeast Asia, and virtually no progress was made in sub-Saharan Africa, where almost half the population was living in poverty. There remains at least 1.1 billion people lacking access to safe drinking water and 2.4 billion lacking adequate sanitation. To help prepare the United Nations to meet these challenges, the General Assembly in September of 2000 adopted the Millennium Declaration, in which world leaders agreed on a far-reaching plan to support global development objectives for the new country. The world's leaders reaffirmed their commitment to work toward a world of peace and security for all, and a world in which sustainable development and poverty eradication would have the highest priority. The Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, evolved from the Millennium Declaration. There are eight international development goals that UN member states agreed to achieve by the year 2015. The first 7 goals are directed toward eradicating poverty in all its forms, having extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality, reducing the mortality of children under age of 5 by 2/3, reducing maternal mortality by 3/4, reversing the spread of HIV/AIDS, the proportion of people without access to safe drinking water, and ensuring environmental sustainability. The final goal, that of building a global partnership for development, is reviewed by some as developing the sort of North-South Pact first envisaged in Rio in 1992. These goals and the commitments of countries to achieve them were affirmed in the launch of the Doha Development Round of international trade negotiations under the World Trade Organization, which commenced in 2001. The Monterey Consensus, which emerged from the United Nations Financing for Development Conference in 2002, and the World Summit on Sustainable Development in September 2002. Summit on Sustainable Development. 10 years after Rio, the United States convened the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, South Africa, to map out a detailed course of action for implementation of Agenda 21. The summit sought to overcome the obstacles to achieving sustainable development and to generate initiatives that would deliver results and improve people's lives while protecting the environment. The World Summit on Sustainable Development opened on August 26, 2002, and brought together government representatives from over 190 countries, including 100 world leaders. An estimated 37,000 people attended either the summit or one of the many gatherings held alongside the main event. As in Stockholm and Rio, there were divergent views among governments on either the summit or one of the many gatherings held alongside the main event. As in Stockholm and Rio, there were divergent views among governments on how to tackle the issues ranging from water and sanitation to desertification, climate change, biodiversity, oceans, health education, science and technology, and trade and finance. The North continued to argue that development in the South needed to be environmentally sound, while the South continued to argue that development had to come first and that it was the responsibility of the North to help the South in this regard. After all, the North got rich while destroying the environment that was now asking the South not to do the same. This was seen by some condemning the South to poverty. To put it simply, the idea in Rio was that the North should act first, shoulder most of the adjustment burden, offer access to environmental technology, and finally engage in some financial redistribution. Then the South would come aboard and eventually share in commitments. 10 years later in Johannesburg, the South argued that the North had not fulfilled its part of the bargain, and therefore that developing countries did not have to fulfill their commitment toward environmentally sound development. The Johannesburg Summit produced 3 key outcomes. The first was the Johannesburg Declaration, a pledge by world leaders to commit fully to the goal of sustainable development. The second was an implementation plan, which set out a comprehensive program of action, included quantifiable goals and targets with fixed deadlines. Finally, the summit produced nearly 300 voluntary partnerships and other initiatives to support sustainable development. Unlike the Johannesburg Declaration and the implementation plan, this major outcome was not the result of multilateral negotiations, including the entire community of nations. Instead, it involved numerous smaller partnerships composed of private sector and civil society groups, as well as governments that committed themselves to a wide range of projects and activities. Many of the commitments and partnerships agreed to in Johannesburg echoed the Millennium Development Goals. For example, countries agreed to commit themselves to having the proportion of people lacking clean water and proper sanitation by 2015. On energy, country billion people lacking access to modern energy services. In addition, while countries did not agree on a target for phasing in renewable energy, which many observers say was a major shortcoming of the summit, they did commit to green energy and the phase out of subsidies for types of energy that were not consistent with sustainable development. On health issues, in addition to actions to fight HIV/AIDS, reduce waterborne diseases, and address the health risks of pollution, countries agreed to phase out by 2020 the use and production of chemicals that harm human health and development. There were also many commitments made to protect biodiversity and improve ecosystem management, reduction in biodiversity loss by 2020, restoration of fisheries to their maximum sustainable yields by 2015, establishment of a representative network of marine protected areas by 2012, and improvement of developing countries' access to environmentally sound alternatives to ozone-depleting chemicals by 2010. Yet among the targets, timetables, commitments, and partnerships that were agreed upon at Johannesburg, there were no silver bullet solutions to fight against poverty and the continually deteriorating natural environment. In fact, as the implementation-focused summit, Johannesburg did not produce a particularly dramatic outcome. There were no agreements that would lead, and many of the agreed targets that had been agreed to at other meetings, including the Millennium Summit, as the UN General Secretary Kofi Annan told the press on the last day of the World Summit on Sustainable Development, I think we have to be careful not to expect conferences like this to produce miracles, but we do expect conferences like this to generate political commitment, momentum, and energy for the attainment of the goals, unquote. Back to Rio. A decade after Johannesburg, 2 decades after Rio, and 4 decades after the Stockholm Conference, the eyes of the world turned back to Rio in June 2012 for yet another global event, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, also referred to as Rio Plus 20, sought to build on past events and redirect the international community had found shortcomings with existing approaches. The evolution of the concept of sustainable development through the UN system reveals a story of different interpretations of sustainable development that have reflected the different priorities of the North and South. The objective of Rio Plus 20 was to secure renewed political commitment for sustainable development, assess the program to date, and the remaining gaps in the implementation of the outcomes of the major summits on sustainable development, and address new and emerging challenges. The conference focused on 2 themes: a green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, and the institutional framework necessary for sustainable development. Together, these 2 themes reflect the continuing struggle to bring the 3 dimensions of sustainable development together: environmental, economic, and social sustainability. In a sense, this conference asked, where will the world be in terms of sustainable development by 2050? The global economic system depends on endless growth, which many believe is clearly unsustainable. The governments of industrialized countries support this economic system because with growing economies, they can pacify the less affluent members of their societies with a slice of a larger pie, instead of having to share the existing pie more equitably. Developing country governments also want their economies to grow, and to that end many have embraced the Western model of development. However, the planet cannot support in such a resource-intensive lifestyle. Hence, there is need for discussions and actions on the shift to a green economy. According to UNEP, a green economy is one that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. It is, in its simplest expression, a green economy can be thought of as one that is low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. A green economy is seen as one whose growth in income and employment is driven by public and private investments that reduce carbon emissions and pollution, enhance energy and resource efficiency, and prevent the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. These investments need to be catalyzed and supported by targeted public expenditure, policy reforms, and regulation changes. This development path should maintain, enhance, and where necessary, rebuild natural capital as a critical economic asset and source of public benefits, especially for poor people whose livelihoods and security depend strongly on nature. The green economy must be discussed within the context of poverty, the lack of employment opportunities for young people, gender inequality, rapid and unplanned urbanization, deforestation, increasing water scarcity, and high HIV prevalence are pervasive obstacles. Moreover, insecurity and instability in conflict and post-conflict countries make long-term sustainable development extremely difficult. With regard to the institutional framework for sustainable development, among other initiatives, Rio+20 took a step that could have an impact on the definition of sustainable development for years to come. The call for defining a set of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to help provide a, quote, concrete approach that delivers means for measuring, in accordance with the context and priorities of each country, both advances as well as bottlenecks in efforts to balance sustained economic growth and the sustainable use of natural resources and the conservation, unquote. Many agreed that MDG experience demonstrated that when there are objectives to guide the international community's effort toward a collective goal, it becomes easier for governments and institutions to work together to reach them. Supporters believe that the SDG approach would generate a series of additional benefits. Internationally agreed objectives could eventually be underpinned by targets, as in the case with the MDGs, which reflect the realities and priorities at the national level, as well as play a role in the guiding public policies. In the end, the Rio+20 outcome document titled The Future We Want agreed to develop, quote, sustainable development goals that should be action-oriented, concise, and easy to communicate, limited in number, nature, and universally applicable to all countries while taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development, and respecting national policies and priorities.